This is our project, Isolated Sociability, and we are
Callum.
Joe.
and Chris. The problem that we're looking to tackle is that loneliness has been a constant problem. However, it has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, and therefore we want to look at a way that architecture can help intervene with this for future pandemics, but also just for future times of normality to prevent the problem of loneliness from getting worse.
We seek to design a scheme that would address loneliness through the guise of preventing mental health issues further down the line.
To tackle this, we also want to implement virtual technologies rather than digital technologies, which we have seen to exacerbate the problem of loneliness. We have distilled this problem into a grammatical haiku. Initially, we started to delve into the terms surrounding loneliness, and the first initial term that came up was isolation. And now this is an act of removing yourself from others, be that voluntary or forced.
People seek solitude through isolation, in which they are able to become more creative through removing distractions. However, prolonged solitude can lead to loneliness.
Loneliness is a social pain that affects the brain, and it can even be felt when around others.
The different types of loneliness are social loneliness, where you are within a group and surrounded by others, but you don't feel part of the dynamic, leading to a form of isolation. Another type is emotional loneliness, the absence of feeling love from family members or friends.
Following on from this, we are currently investigating different philosophies such as Wabi Sabi, which has its roots in loneliness, and Foucault's relationship to power, and looking at the panopticon as a way of perhaps reconfiguring isolation.
We're beginning to understand that isolation can result in two forms that the user may experience, such as loneliness and solitude. While these two both surround the same circumstances and are a result of isolation, both of them offer very different things.
Spaces of isolation.
While a bar can be seen as a very sociable place for people to visit, there are still instances of social isolation that can be viewed, but these can often be seen as solitude, but also be seen as isolating for the user as well. It just depends on how they want to experience the space. Public transport can see as very isolating, and as journeys are normally long for people to come into the city and local towns, these can be very isolating and lonely. After reviewing certain spaces on the tube and being familiar with ourselves of the experiences of going and using public transport, we identified that even though the seating areas are often could be seen as very social spaces, more than often the standing spaces are seen as more sociable because people would choose to rather stand together and socialize rather than sit down separately, because normally there'd be sporadic people sitting down in certain carriages. This can also be exacerbated by technology as well, such as headphones, people on listening to music, and a variety of other technology.
Started to look at these spaces from a living aspect and created short films which document how people are able to isolate themselves from one another using digital technologies and just their positioning. Spaces of solitude.
An interesting space to review is these hybrid cafe libraries that, even though people will visit on their lunch breaks to feel some sense of solitude and isolation from the working environment, people will still choose to be in these spaces to feel the social atmosphere and the environment that these spaces give off. Another interesting example of solitude that can be seen is monasteries or places of worship. So, for instance, even though these people will come to feel some sense of solitude, what is interesting is these spaces tend to be very vast and very grand, so often leaving the person very small and insignificant.
These places do offer solitude, but however, the grand stature of the ceilings can provide this feeling of being small and lonely within the space as well.
Ajanta is an early example of a Buddhist monastery which revolves around an early form of the cloister method, in which it has a communal hall and private cells around the perimeter. This leads to a division in the monastery where people are isolated within their cells for silent prayer and meditation, yet also have a communal aspect in the central Vihara hall, which helps prevent loneliness. Whilst Ajanta is over 2,000 years old, Meteora Monastery still revolves around that central cloistered courtyard. Shows how this layout has been successful across the ages and also across different religions, preventing loneliness in a secluded monastery. As you can see here, the monk cells encompass the courtyard space, which creates an active space within the center of the monastery. This prevents loneliness as there are always people around working or praying. Spaces of loneliness.
Another space which can be often overlooked as very isolating can be hospitals, especially for people and patients who have chronic illnesses or require special care over long periods of time. These people are often living their lives here for a great amount of time, and yet they are very isolating spaces. They don't necessarily encourage social interaction, and that can often leave the patients feeling very disconnected from society and their families. An example of forced isolation, though, which we were reviewing, is a prison. Here, isolation is a form of punishment, rather than being seen as a time of solace and reflection.
This makes the difference between loneliness and solitude perhaps be the power of whether one can remove themselves from isolation or not. When exploring making the following film, we noticed that when solitary confinement is detailed, the ceiling element is not shown, which gives a sense of being small, very reminiscent of high ceilings within cathedrals. And this is something that we hope to learn from in creating spaces that deal with loneliness. Potential sites.
So loneliness in Liverpool continues to be an increasing problem. And there's some stats suggesting that more than 2 people's lives are being lost to suicide each week in Merseyside. And now, while there are a lot of events and social gatherings organised by local parishes within the city centre and outside in suburbia, these are often funded by small parishes and small private companies, and they are more targeted towards the elderly. There's nothing really there to encourage the student body. And while the university does offer this, there's no real centre that kind of unites these two demographics together. What's more interesting is that St Helens supposedly had the highest suicide rate in all the UK a few years ago, and that continues to be an ever-growing issue. So what would be interesting to try and review and discuss is if there's a intervention which could be designed that would be more united in providing a solution to loneliness, but that also incorporates a modern solution using technology.
This map highlights households with only one person living in them across the UK. In Merseyside, particularly around the centre of Liverpool, there is a high proportion of households which have one person living in them. And households don't necessarily mean they are lonely, but these households have a higher chance of loneliness. This contributes to the ever-growing issue of loneliness in Liverpool.
This image describes Seoul's problems with loneliness, which are split into 2 different aspects, detailing the Honjok, which is to do with the lonely tribe and focused around younger people, and Godoksa, which is focused around poverty in older people and lonely deaths as a result of it. Within Honjok, because of the traditional structure of South Korean culture, it is important for people to strive for a meaningful career, which means that lots of people end up working too hard and cutting off different aspects of their life, which lead to loneliness. And the huge wealth inequality within South Korea has meant that basement living and slum living has become the norm, with many people living alone within these things, exacerbating loneliness. The dotted line that you can see on the image represents the suicide rate, which, because of some of South Korea's interventions, was beginning to fall, however, has been exacerbated since 2018 and exponentially since the COVID-19 pandemic. As previously stated, the Honjok, which means the Lonely Tribe, is based around young people's relationship to loneliness, and this is because there are three different structures within the Honjok. The Sampo Sedai, which is the free giving up generation, which gives up relationship, marriage, and children. Oppo Sedai, which gives up 5 things, including the previous 3, meaningful career and home ownership, and Wampo Sedai, which is the 7 giving up generation, which gives up all of the scene, including any relationships and any hope. After Wampo Sedai, the only thought is that suicide is the only option for people to be able to get any peace from their life. And this is why South Korea has the second highest suicide rate in the OECD, and suicide is the leading cause of death in people aged 10 to 39, with 20 people dying per year per 100,000 people within South Korea. Within Gadoksa, which is the lonely deaths, over 60s have had the highest poverty inequality in the OECD, which means that quite a lot of them live in slums and in basements, and quite a lot of them live alone. Now, preventative measures that have started have included people doing bi-weekly visits to individuals' houses and implementing the sort of sharing economy with the people of the Honjok. However, these preventative measures have not seemed to have had a great effect, as the loneliness epidemic has continued to be exacerbated, pushed so even more by COVID-19.
Another country we looked at was Sweden. 47% of Swedish households are currently occupied by only one person. Therefore, there is a high chance of people getting lonely. This is particularly noticeable in the age groups of 16 to 24, where 17% of individuals say they had felt alone during the last 2 weeks. Only Swedes in over the 75s category reported high levels of loneliness. Sweden's trying to tackle this through multi-generational living. They've introduced a collective housing concept in which people under 25 and pensioners are allowed to rent, but are required to spend at least 2 hours a week socializing in the communal areas. This has started to help people living alone to feel more of a sense of community, particularly helping out the young people and elderly who are most affected by this.
Why the virtual can help with loneliness. So currently we use a lot of digital technologies to connect with one another. However, when you have a social interaction in person, you get a certain amount of dopamine, which is what the body needs. However, through digital technologies, because you have to curate your social interaction through the medium, it's not as fluid as a in-person social interaction, and you don't get the right amount of dopamine, leaving you with a deficiency, which creates the social pain of loneliness. Virtual technologies, on the other hand, allow oneself to fully transpose their actions and movements into a 3D space and interact with others accordingly. And therefore you get a larger amount of dopamine from these social interactions. And while it won't be as much currently as it will be in person, over time this will steadily start to increase as more and more technology is being implemented to allow us to access the virtual reality to a greater extent. Following on from this, we use the Liverpool Architecture Society's New Normal competition to test our initial ideas with regards to loneliness, isolation, and virtual technologies.
Through this pavilion, we wanted to create a space which would facilitate interaction between people remotely in the virtual and people being at the pavilion in reality.
Pavilion offers social active space as well as intimate spaces provided by the pods. These pods allow the public and the user to interact with virtual presences projected onto the water. Not only does this as a space to provide an overall active space for people to communicate together. But these intimate pods are also offer a sense of reflection and solitude for the user.
Section detailing the physical interaction and then the interaction between a person and the physical pod and the virtual environment.
This is the plan of the pavilion on site at Man Island.
Pavilion structure is made up of simple glued-on structural beams and plywood slabs that hold up a zinc-cladded roof.
The following a collection of renders of the pavilion in situ.
We aim to use this pavilion as a catalyst of the ideas we wish to explore through interaction of lonely people being connected through the virtual, through an architectural environment. We aim to explore this further through our thesis.